Alright folks, how's it going? I'm Cams Campbell, your host, and today we're looking at Chapter 7 of Doctor Zhivago. This will be going out as an essay on my Substack over at camscampbellreads.substack.com, where you'll be able to see images and click links and all that fun stuff. Of course, you'll see images as well in the video, which this is also going out as, and also as an audio podcast, where you won't see the images, obviously, but there will be links in the description to the podcast where you can go off and check out the sources for all the images and extra bits and bobs. So, with all that preamble done, let's get into Chapter 7. It's a bit of a long one this week, covering 31, what do we call them? Sections? Parts? I don't know. I'm choosing to call the main chunks that we do weekly chapters. Some people call them parts. Your mileage may vary, but I'm calling them chapters, and let's call them sections. I don't know. Right. It's a long chapter this week, and it covers a lot of ground, both in terms of plot and distance travelled by Yuri and his family. The Zhivagos are getting ready to leave for Varykino. Yuri doesn't want to go. He talks of the old Mikulitsin, the estate manager, whose name he remembers only because the family struggled to pronounce it. And no wonder. There's an image here of a train at the Eastern Front during the Civil War, an armoured train of the 6th Regiment of the Czechoslovak Corps, advance on Marianovka from June 1918. Yuri goes to the station to see how one travels these days. It's chaos, with sick people lying on floors for refuge. A porter tells Yuri to come every day to check for trains, and that he'll need to pay a bribe to grease the wheels. He taps his Adam's apple and mentions bringing vodka. This is still something that Russians do to indicate drinking alcohol. One folk explanation traces the history back to Peter the Great, though I take it with a pinch of salt. Quote, "How did this strange gesture come about? A legend has it that after a carpenter was able to fix a cross on the tallest spire of the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul in St. Petersburg, Peter the Great wanted to thank him for his service. When the carpenter was asked what he would like as a reward, he said he wanted a piece of paper which would entitle him to a free drink in any tavern across the land. Unfortunately, he ended up losing the paper after getting blind drunk one day. So the Tsar authorised a tattoo on his neck, and all the carpenter would need to do was to tap the side of his neck to show the stamp." There's a link here to a short video which shows the gesture, but if you're watching the video, you've just seen me do it 3 times. Yuri is called in to treat a member of the government and is paid in vouchers for the, quote, "newly introduced closed consumer shops," end quote. These were early examples of the privileged distribution networks that would later become a permanent feature of Soviet life. Yuri and Alexander Gromyko, who has also received vouchers, go to the shop and fill pillowcases with products unavailable to the masses, flour, sugar, etc. Tonya's at home taking care of the packing. It sounds complicated. Their money should be in Keryenkas, paper bills introduced by the Kerensky government in 1917. They were short-lived due to the period's massive inflation. There's a snowstorm the day before they are due to leave. Tonya leaves the flat in the care of an elderly couple who live in the building. Both Yuri and Tonya feel emotional at having to leave the flat. It reminds them of those they've lost. Yuri and Tonya leave at dawn. It's snowing. Tonya and her father take a cab to the station, and Yuri, at his own request, walks. Tonya and her father are queuing for tickets. My translation says that Nyusha and Sasha were walking about outside, and I was like, Nyusha? She's first mentioned at the start of Chapter 6 as a nanny for Yuri and Tonya's son Sasha. The P&V translation lists them as Nyusha and Shurachka, and Tonya is named as Antonina Alexandrovna. That's how the original text lists the characters too, so it's wild how different the translations are. It's still snowing. Quote, "The falling snow could be seen only beyond the far end of the roofs. Seen so far away, it looked almost still, sinking to the ground as slowly as breadcrumbs thrown to the fishes sink through water." I just like that wee quotation. Chaos erupts when people waiting to board the train see queue jumpers. They'd calm down if they only knew that these queue jumpers were in fact convicts bound for the front. The Zhivagos managed to get a corner to themselves on the top tier of bunks. It reminds me of Pasternak's lover Olga's being taken to a labour camp in 1950. Quote, "From Butyrki, Olga and the other prisoners were crammed into a passenger coach. The stench was suffocating. Olga was fortunate enough to get a berth on the luggage rack at the top of the compartment from where she could see the sky." And that's a quotation from a book by Anna Pasternak called Lara, and it talks about Olga Ivinskaya as being the inspiration for Lara. There are hundreds of passengers from all walks of life, and the journey is long and uncomfortable. Tonya wakes as they approach a large station. Napkins of snow are hung on trees as a sign of hospitality, mirroring the tradition of offering salt on napkins. Locals have come to meet the train to trade their wares. Tonya trades her embroidered towel for half a roasted hare. A swindler eats a trader's food and goes off without paying. The conscript wagons are not big enough to hold them all, so some have been distributed among the passengers. There are a few in car 14, the car the Zhivagos are travelling in. It turns out that the train will be travelling through the Vyatka province, the home province of two conscripts in the rail car. We learn that one of the conscripts, Pritulev, was picked up during a militia roundup in Petersburg. Note that Pasternak does not use the more recent moniker of Petrograd, a deliberate decision on his part. Recall that we discussed the Burg suffix as sounding too German in our previous chapter essay. Pasternak is quietly resisting the renaming of cities for ideological reasons, patriotic though this one may have been. The younger conscript Vasya is there simply because his uncle went through the wrong door and was rounded up with the other conscripts. His uncle then tricked the guards into letting him say goodbye to his wife, and they took Vasya as security. The uncle and aunt disappeared, and thus Vasya was recruited. One of the conscripts, Kostoyed, discusses the peasants' plight following the revolution with Yuri. Yuri believes that the peasants outside the main cities are living as before, without any hardship being imposed on them by those above. Kostoyed disagrees. Quote, "When the revolution came and woke him, the peasant, he decided that this was the fulfilment of his dream. Instead of that, he found he had only exchanged the old oppression of the Tsarist state for the new, much harsher yoke of the revolutionary superstate." End quote. Yuri replies that history hasn't consulted him, and so why should he bother? Quote, "It's true that I want to believe that the peasants are better off and the villages are prosperous. If I can't believe that, then what am I to do? I've got to go on living. I've got a family." End quote. Vasya and Pritulev talk of their home villages as the train passes through their province. The train passes through regions where armed bands were patrolling. The train is often stopped and papers are checked by security patrols. It stops one night and Yuri gets off to see what's going on. The sailors on the train go and see, and it looks to Yuri like they're chasing the driver. Yuri follows, finding the driver half buried in deep snow and arguing with the sailors. The driver had stopped for safety's sake, and the sailors are angry about it. The train moves at a snail's pace the next day. The snow has made the journey treacherous. The train stops at a burned-out village and the driver quizzes the station master about what happened. It's the first time we hear the name Strelnikov. He's some kind of renegade revolutionary in an armoured train, and he had taken out the village after mistaking it for another village of the same name in a different district. Their crime? anti-revolutionary activity. The station master tells the driver that he'll have to wait out the blizzard for a couple of days. The snow is too deep for the train to pass. The passengers are supplied with shovels and they dig out the snow for 3 days to allow the train to pass. Quote, "These were the best 3 days of the journey. There was something about it, the country, that reminded one of the rising of Pugachev as seen by Pushkin and the savage Asia of Aksakov's sketches." Pugachev led a peasant and Cossack rebellion in 1773-74. He claimed to be the murdered Tsar Peter III, returned from the dead, and to have gathered up a peasant army. Pushkin is mentioned as this is the theme of his story, The Captain's Daughter. Edith W. Close remarks on Pasternak's Pushkin influence. Quote, "Neither is it by chance that Pushkin's lengthiest prose fiction, the historical romance The Captain's Daughter, 1833-36, finds frequent echo in the second half of Doctor Zhivago. These two works form the major milestones in Pushkin's own effort to shift from long verse narrative to the prose novel." Aksakov was a 19th century Russian writer known for his descriptions of life in the Volga-Ural region, which he depicted as the borderland between Europe and Asia. The Ural Mountains are regarded as the geographical border between these two continents and cultures. Aksakov's sketches are a series of autobiographical and nature pieces, including Notes on Fishing, 1847, and Notes of a Provincial Wildfowler, 1852. Pasternak suggests that the revolution has scraped away the veneer of civilization and revealed the old country beneath. Yuri finds himself wondering whether the house he can see atop a hill is inhabited. Quote, "The house teased his curiosity, but kept its sorrowful silence. Questions were not in order these days, and no one ever answered them." End quote. What a line. In Lara, Anna Pasternak gives us an idea of where this scene came from in Boris's mind. Boris's sister Josephine, 1900 to 1993, says, quote, "Josephine's last memories of her childhood in Moscow were the gruelling winters when the town was covered in snow and the citizens had to report at labour centres. Quote, they were given spades and perhaps a day's ration and had to clear the roads." End quote, she remembered. Quote, "Lydia was underage and did not need to report, but she went instead of me as I was not strong enough to shovel the heavy snow. She and Boris were in the same group." End quote. It must have been an unforgettable day, a day of such brilliance of sun and snow, of purity of landscape, of concerted effort, and of friendliness among the people at work. End quote. Yuri will forever recall the ruined station as a place of refuge. The snow has finally cleared enough for the train to move on. Yuri and Tonya are out on the tracks before the train leaves. They overhear two voices arguing from the other side of the tracks. It's the two women who are travelling with conscript Pritulev. They're fighting over him. In the Hayward and Harari translation, we get this line. "Born in the gutter, married in a ditch, laid by a rat, and a hedgehog for a brat." The same line in Pevir and Volokhonsky. "Born in a ditch, married in a gateway, made pregnant by a rat, gave birth to a hedgehog." In the original text, just for the sake of completion, "Из канавы рожденная, в подворотне венчанная, крысой забрюхатела, ёжем разродилась." As they travel, the scenery changes from open steppe to the rugged terrain of the Urals. Pasternak gives us a poetic scene of the coming of spring as the snows melt and the forests awaken. The villages become more frequent, and Yuri overhears local passengers discussing the politics of the region. The Whites are gaining the upper hand over the Reds and, unless he's misheard, are being led by Galyulin, whom he last saw at Melozievo. Yuri awakens in the middle of the night with an intense sense of happiness. The train has stopped near a waterfall and the sound is soothing. Two men are talking below his bunk about corn requisitioning. They hear another train. It's Strelnikov's armoured train. The two men discuss whom Strelnikov is hunting. Hetman Galileev, Prince Galileev, or Ali Kurban. They aren't sure. Yuri awakens again, still feeling a sense of happiness. The next morning, Tonya tells Yuri that Pritulev and Vasya have escaped, along with two women who were fighting over Pritulev. So too has their guard, Varykino. The labour unit commander is demanding that the train remain where it is until the prisoners are caught, while the train commandant is refusing because he has conscripts to transport to the front. Pasternak gives us another poetic description of the landscape. The train appears to be gliding over the surface meltwater. I've got some images here, one showing a map of the Urals, another a Ural village, and yet a third showing a train travelling through the Urals. We get a switch in the point of view character. We are now with Vasya, the young escapee. He's mesmerised by the waterfall. He's with one of the women who, it seems, had pushed the other one off the train. They've been on the run for 2 days. Vasya urges Auntie Polya to go. They must get to a village. The train stops to refuel. The passengers disembark and volunteers are called to cut wood for the tender. Yuri and Alexander Gromyko share a saw. They discuss their convictions while they saw the wood. Gromyko says, quote, "The regime is hostile to us. Its philosophy is alien to me. I have not been asked if I consent to all these changes. But I have been trusted, and my own actions, even if they were not freely chosen, put me under a certain obligation." End quote. He goes on to say that he's on board with the new regime in a way. He'll pitch in with the, quote, "collective squandering of thousands for the sake of earning a kopek's worth of living." No, the age of property in Russia is over, and anyway, we Gromykos lost our acquisitive passion a generation ago. End quote. Yuri awakens early. It's too hot and stifling in the train car. The train is shrouded in mist. Yuri hears distant artillery fire and remembers that they are near the front. Which front, though? Good question. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed in March 1918, pulling Russia out of the Great War. The civil war following the October Revolution is now breaking out between the Reds, the Bolsheviks, and the loosely allied anti-Bolshevik Whites, and the Urals region saw some of the fiercest fighting, as we shall see shortly. There's an image here of some white guards in a trench at the Eastern Front, taken in 1919. Yuri steps around the front of the train and is stopped by a sentry. They argue and Yuri walks away before it gets serious. He hears sounds coming from the river and goes down to the bank to investigate. He's stopped by a second sentry who also questions him. The first sentry had followed Yuri through the mist, and now the two of them demand Yuri's papers and take him off to see the boss. The sounds on the river had been made by a fisherman who tells Yuri that the sentries are hunting someone and have simply mistaken him for their quarry. Yuri should demand to see the boss and it will all be straightened out. Yuri learns from the fisherman that Uryatin has now been recaptured by the Reds and that the boss in question is Army Commissar Strelnikov. A third guard appears and leads Yuri off to see Strelnikov, who is using a train car as his headquarters. Yuri is taken to Strelnikov. Quote, Yuri had had a very different idea of the background of Strelnikov, the famous non-party military expert who was the pride and terror of the region. End quote. I ask that you keep this scene in mind for reasons I don't want to reveal just yet, since Pasternak isn't revealing it now either. Yuri's taken by the way that Strelnikov's staff are busy with trifles, fixing phone lines, getting the typewriter unjammed, while outside there's a war going on. He figures that he can't be in any trouble. Yuri stares out the window and sees a scrapyard for old train engines and cars. As the mist begins to clear, he can just make out the town of Uryatin on top of the hill. He recalls how Lara Antipova had talked of it when they were at the front. He sees some prisoners being led by Red Army guards, including a schoolboy with a head wound. Yuri's taken by the boy's school cap, which keeps falling down over the boy's eyes, and he then jams it back on his head. Quote, Yuri longed to rush out and address the boy in words which were boiling up inside him. He longed to shout to him and to the people in the railway coach that salvation lay not in loyalty to forms and uniforms, but in throwing them away. End quote. This scene illustrates Pasternak's view on life as perfectly summed up by Italo Calvino and quoted in the Zhivago affair. Quote, in a long essay entitled Pasternak and the Revolution, Italo Calvino wrote that halfway through the 20th century, the great Russian 19th century novel has come back to haunt us, like King Hamlet's ghost. Calvino argued that Pasternak is not interested in psychology, character, situations, but in something more general and direct, life. Pasternak's prose is simply a continuation of his verse. He wrote that Pasternak's objections to Soviet communism seemed to move in two directions, against the barbarism with ruthless cruelty unleashed by the Civil War, and against the theoretical and bureaucratic abstractions in which the revolutionary ideals became frozen. End quote. Strelnikov enters. He makes an impressive entrance as a confident, powerful man. Quote, how was it that they had never been thrown together, that their paths had never crossed? End quote. Or had they? Strelnikov congratulates the men on having successfully driven back the enemy. The enemy commander had once been a friend of Strelnikov's. They'd grown up together. He remembers that Yuri is there and sees immediately that he's not the man they're looking for. All the same, he takes a look at his papers and the name Doctor Zhivago seems familiar to him somehow. Who, in reality, was Strelnikov? Pasternak must have been having fun with this reveal. It's not laid out as to be unequivocal, but he gives us just enough for the reader to figure out who Strelnikov is. Look for the clues. Born in Moscow, university, school teacher in the provinces, missing in action from the front, believed killed, lived with Tverzin as a child. His father was jailed after the 1905 revolution. Are you getting it? There is an argument to be made about Strelnikov's being at least partly inspired by Leon Trotsky. Trotsky famously led the Red Army from an armoured train, having come not from a military background but from a bookish intellectual one. He also became a semi-mythical military commander, known for his ferocity in destroying the enemy with no apparent compassion. It's hard to say whether Trotsky was a conscious inspiration for Pasternak, but the resemblance is striking enough that it's difficult to read the Strelnikov scenes without thinking of him. Strelnikov asks Yuri why he's leaving Moscow for Varykino. He calls Yuri a deserter and tells him that it's the time for, quote, angels with flaming swords and winged beasts from the abyss, not for sympathisers and loyal doctors, end quote. He had, however, promised to let Yuri go, and this he does, but, quote, just this once. We leave the chapter with the reveal nailed home. Strelnikov looks out the window towards where he'd lived with his wife and daughter, where he'd been a school teacher. It is, of course, Pasha Antipov. So I just love the way that Pasternak deals with this reveal. It's still not spelled out completely unequivocally, but I think we've had enough clues that I don't feel bad about revealing it unequivocally here on tape, because I think that if you weren't getting it yet, you're probably going to miss something as the story continues. Did I get it at this point when I read it in March for the first time? I think I did, I'm going to give myself credit for that. It's different, of course, if you're watching the movie or the TV adaptation by Andrew Davies, which I'm currently watching and enjoying, starring Keira Knightley as Lara and Hans somebody as Yuri, somebody unknown to me before, and the guy from Love Actually who goes to America and gets some girlfriends over there because of his accent. Do you remember that scene? That guy, I can't remember his name, but he plays Pasha / Strelnikov. And obviously in a visual medium, you can't really hide a reveal like that. Although they do kind of, when Pasha goes onto the train and you can see Pasha / Strelnikov from behind. So at that point, they do kind of get around it a little bit, but when you're seeing an actor, you can't really hide that it's two different people, you know what I mean? But yeah, so what's happened to Pasha? How has he gone from being Lara's husband? You remember when he left her, it was due to a sort of feeling of inferiority. You know, he was a bit down on himself. He believed that Lara didn't really love him. And they'd gone to be school teachers together in Uryatin in the Urals. And then he disappeared when he heard the sound of a troop carrier going past, a troop train. And he decided there and then that he was going to enlist, which he does. He goes off to enlist. And in the Andrew Davies adaptation, you see scenes of him running around with the Red Army, you know, or no, he must be at the front at that point. So we don't really learn how he goes from that and then supposedly being killed to becoming a formidable army commander in the Red Army. I suppose that's something that we can maybe discuss here. You know, how does that happen to someone? Somebody with an inferiority complex who's not very confident, not very warlike, you know, becomes a ruthless army commander who kills without compassion. It's an interesting thing to ponder, isn't it? What strikes me here is, I mean, obviously we're looking at 100 years ago in historical terms, so the way people lived, the way they dressed, everything about them would have been old-fashioned. But the Urals wouldn't have changed a bit. The scenery that they're travelling through, and the way that Pasternak describes those scenes, you know, the scenes of the open steppe, the forests, the meltwater, the snow is melting. It's very poetic. It's very lyrical, and I think is just a delight. And having seen some of that region myself, you know, I'm amazed at how evocative his writing is. I haven't actually been to the Urals, but I have been to the Caucasus, different mountain range entirely, but, you know, scenery is scenery and doesn't change all that much over centuries and over millennia. So that fascinates me, the idea that humanity scurrying about, living in the moment that it's in, while the slow-moving, geographical, geological, you know, the world, it just remains as it is for the most part. And I imagine that it's one of the most beautiful places on earth, unless you're stuck outside with poor clothing and no shelter, you know, then it would be pretty grim. You know, my mind goes to the labour camps. And that's partly because I'm reading Lara, which tells the story of Olga Ivinskaya, the inspiration for Lara, and Olga herself was taken off to a labour camp for 3 years. She got a 5-year sentence, but she served only 3 because Stalin just happened to die while she was in camp, 1953, March the 8th. And she gets a reprieve during well, it's not quite a thaw, but things change after Stalin dies, and Olga goes back to be with her lover, Pasternak. So, yeah, it's endlessly fascinating. I'm really enjoying this method of reading the book nice and slowly and looking up extra material. That Lara book is incredible. And the Zhivago affair, which I've also quoted in this essay, is itself a fascinating story that goes into the story behind how the CIA was involved in getting the novel published in Russian, outside of Russia, and then smuggled into Russia as a kind of subversive measure, It's fascinating. So that's the end of chapter 7. It was a long one, some 40 pages or so. I think next week's will be a bit shorter, and I look forward to seeing you then. Remember that you can read the essay over at camscampbellreads.substack.com, and you can also print a downloadable PDF which has all the images removed in order to save ink, so that you can take the document with you to work and read when you're supposed to be doing work, or take it to the park or wherever you want to take it. Take it to the Urals, how about that? Read it on the train on the way through the Ural Mountains. That would be amazing. So, yeah, that's where all the downloads are, over at my Substack. And if you're watching this on YouTube, as it's come out as a public video, you're actually 1 week behind, because I put these out a week in advance as unlisted videos on Substack as a perk for the Substack subscribers. And I would love it if you'd go over there and subscribe to my Substack anyway, because I'm hoping to grow that into something wonderful for the internet, So I would appreciate your support over there. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube as well, subscribe on YouTube. If you're reading this on Substack and watching it from there, give my YouTube a wee subscribe, will you? Because, I'm a struggling writer / video maker. And I would love your support. I mean, I know I've got it already, because you wouldn't be watching a Chapter 7 video if you weren't already supporting me. So really, I should be saying thank you for your support instead of begging for it. So take this as a thank you. All right, my friends. Thank you very much. See you in Chapter 8. Bye.